What is up, guys? My name is Andrew and welcome back to Space Camp, the series in Space Engineers where I explain how to do stuff. So whether you're an experienced player or just a beginner at Space Engineers, you can probably find something from this series. In this slightly more advanced episode of Space Camp, we're taking a look at rotors, and though they may seem docile right now, it's very important to know how to use them, otherwise they could seriously mess your game up. But don't worry about that, follow this tutorial and you'll know exactly how to use them and so that they won't screw stuff up. Okay, so what are rotors? Well, essentially rotors in Space Engineers are the way to make things turn. And you can see a couple of examples over here, how they're just, all they do is make something turn. Just like a clock, or like a turntable. It's basically what it is. Now, rotors are a bit different than most blocks in Space Engineers in that they create a separate grid on top. So there's two parts to a rotor. There's the bottom part, which is the main rotor part, and then there is the rotor head, which is essentially a second grid that's on top of this current grid. So we have this main grid right here that we're standing on. This is all one big grid, and in fact, you can see it if I zoom out a little bit and then Control X on it, but press no because I don't want to delete it. You'll see the green line around the grid. That's one grid. However, anything on top of a rotor, or the rotor head and above, is a separate grid that's basically just placed on top of the rotor head. The reason the game does it this way is because having the same grid have part of it rotate and then part of it not rotate is not really supported very well by the game engine, I would imagine. So this is how they do it. They just have create a subgrid is what it's called on top of the main grid so that it can do any rotational stuff or extending stuff that it needs to do. Now let's take a little look at some of the settings inside the rotor. So first of all, you have your on-off, etc., your normal settings, but then you have a thing called safety detach. Now, one thing that's common with these rotor heads, since they create a subgrid, is sometimes the subgrid can kind of get out of sync with the main grid, and it can start going crazy and doing weird stuff. Well, the safety detach tells it that if it goes too crazy, go ahead and detach that grid. Now, we actually have a couple of options. We have a 5 meter, I think that's a deviation from the original. So this is like the rigid kind of structure here. A 5 meter deviation, which would be like kind of out here. If this were out here for some reason, that would go ahead and detach it. Of course, we can lower that if we wanted to, and we can see the effects. So let's go ahead and lower that all the way down to 10 centimeters, which means any deviation pretty much from here, we'll go ahead and detach that. And we can show that as well. Let's go into our rotor tutorial one. And if we go down to our rotor displacement, we can actually very slowly move it up and down. Well, if we move it too fast, it'll count as like a deviation. It'll actually detach. So look, there we go. We've done it. This goes grayed out, and now it's detached. It's not connected anymore. If it were turning, it wouldn't be turning anymore. Anything on top of it would suddenly fall down, and it's bad. So for your general use, what you're probably going to want to do is turn that safety detach all the way up. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to reattach that. No, it doesn't want to reattach. Okay, it doesn't really want to reattach to the grid, so what we're going to do is we're going to delete it first. So we just go ahead and delete the rotor head piece. That's one part of it, and then don't delete the bottom part. If we go back into that same rotor, we can go here and add a rotor head. This actually brings me to another point, is you have two rotor head types you can add. You can add a large rotor head or a small rotor head, and we see an example here. This is a large rotor head where it allows large grids. That's gigantic blocks like this, large blocks. And then we have a small rotor head that allows you to place smaller blocks, like that. Or if I press number 4 again, like that, little small blocks. So if you want to, I mean, that can be useful for a couple things. Like in this case, for example, we do use the small rotor head to make a more detailed door. It has a much thinner profile, which is nice. Or not door, but fan. So yeah, you can use large or small rotor heads. For this one, we're just going to use a large one because it's the normal one. We'll just stick a large one on there, and we'll make sure to bring that safety detach all the way back up because we don't want that happening. And again, if it's all the way up, you know, you won't see that issue with the rotor displacement bugging out. Now we skipped over a setting here. This is share inertia tensor. It makes your subgrid up there. So any subgrid that we have on here, this would be considered the subgrid. It makes that subgrid and this subgrid, the main subgrid, act as one. Now this is very useful if, for instance, you have multiple rotors stacked on top of each other and you want them all to have kind of like the same mass or share the same mass so they don't wig out or anything. That's good to share inertia tensors, and we'll show that a little bit later on as well. Back into the settings, we have an option to reverse. So if you have a grid that's going a certain velocity, you can actually reverse that and it'll bring that into the negative of that velocity. So that's useful if you want to do stuff that involves turning things around. Coolio. We have a detach, which will just detach the rotor head. That might make it unoperable. And then under that, you have an attach button as well. You have an attach right here, which can occasionally bring it back. Now, of course, you saw that it followed the mass kind of as I detached this, so it just kind of fell. If it's too large and it falls way off the rotor, it's not going to attach again. So you have to be very careful when dealing with those. In fact, I would never press detach unless you really want to get rid of your rotor. Moving on down the settings, we have a rotor lock button, which makes it so that the rotor won't move even if you have like a velocity, it won't do anything. Under that, we have a torque option, which is basically how strong the rotor is. So if you have something that is like, I don't know, if you're making like gears out of rotors, for instance, and you wanted the gears to turn other gears or something, you need a high torque. Whereas if you're doing something where you wanted the rotors to spin freely, a torque of 0 would probably be nice for that. Right under torque, we have the braking torque, which is the braking strength that happens when you turn off the rotor. So if we apply a velocity right here and we have a braking torque of 0, and then we turn off the rotor, you'll see that the thing doesn't actually stop very easily. But if we bump up that braking torque, you'll see it starts to slow down a little bit. So now if we were to turn it back on and off, it should stop instantly. So turn that all the way down if you want it to not actually do anything once you hit the stop button. Like that. You can just have it continue forever. Pew! I don't know if it'll continue forever. I guess we'd have to sit here for a long time. In fact, it does look like it's slowing down a little bit. So even with 0 braking torque, it's still got a little bit of oomph to brake it. Under the velocity, we have our limits. So we have a lower limit and an upper limit, and that corresponds to this current angle right here. So our lower limit is how low it can go if we have a negative velocity. See, it's going down. The lower limit is how low it can go. So let's put it to something like 250. So 250. If we go down more, it'll stop at 250. It can't go any farther than that. We can even go up and then back down. It'll stop at 250. And if we do upper limit at like 300, we can, oops, not braking torque. We can bump up that velocity right there, and we can keep hitting reverse, and it'll keep stopping at 250 and 300 every time we hit reverse. And this is extremely useful if you are trying to make like a door or anything that's supposed to go to a certain area and then reverse or anything like that. This is very useful to have these limits here. And in fact, what they actually correspond to these numbers right here. So if you're kind of having trouble lining things up, what you can do is, you know, build whatever thing you want, and then you can look at this little line right here. It corresponds to a number. So you can see that this right here is 180. So if we wanted this point right here, the long point right here, to stop at 180, we'd put our lower limit to 180. So let's go to our rotor, put our lower limit right here. By the way, I'm doing control click so I can enter it in. We'll put that limit right there to 180. So now it's going to go all the way down to 180. And then if we want our upper limit to be 270, we can put that in as well, and it'll stop. It'll do like a 90-degree kind of thing. So let's go to our rotor, control click 270, and then we can just hit reverse, and it'll keep going like that. So we have a 90-degree angle right there. And that's one easy way to see what angles you are working with. The final setting we have on the rotor is all the way down here, and that's the rotor displacement. That makes the rotor go up and down, and you can actually see that kind of at the top of the screen there. Might be a little hard to see, but you can see the rotor going up and down. You can even see the shadow. That's useful if you want to make it a little higher, a little bit lower for whatever reason. I'm sure there are many reasons you could do that. It's like a baby little piston. So that's all of the parts of a rotor. Oh, actually, wait, hang on. We didn't even talk about velocity, did we? Let's go into the rotor real quick, and I'll talk about velocity. So velocity is how fast your rotor is going to turn. Now, velocity works differently than other things in Space Engineers because it's rotational velocity. It's rotations per minute. So if we do 1 RPM, like this, then it's going to rotate at 1 rotation per minute. Well, it's not turning. Oh, because we still have our limits set. Let's right-click on our limits to set them back to default, which is unlimited. So this is rotating at 1 rotation per minute with 1 RPM. So every minute, this is going to come back around to that good old 270 mark. And it's going to take a minute. It's going to take that long. And that's how RPMs work, is rotations per minute. And the reason it works with rotations per minute, by the way, is because depending on where you are on the circle, so if you see that like this makes a circle as it goes around, depending where you are on the circle, you're going a different actual velocity. So for instance, right here, we're going, you see 0.3, whatever, 32. But if we go all the way to the edge, we're going a little bit faster, 0.8. So the farther out you are on a rotational area, the faster you're going. And if we're in the center, we're almost going 0. So, because the outer part has to move faster than the inner part. So that's why it's measured in rotational velocity instead of standard just velocity, in case you were wondering. Okay, that's all the settings to a rotor. Let's go and take a look at some examples of rotors that we have. So we have this one, which is just a rotor with some stuff on it. It's just like this one that we have right there, and it's just turning around normally. Then we have this one right here, which is a small grid rotor. I just wanted to show off how you can make something small kind of work like this. Now, one thing I should note is that everything that's on top of a rotor, you know it's a subgrid. So if you go in here, it's actually got a different color for the subgrids. And don't worry about red stuff. That's just stuff that's incomplete. I'm talking about the orange stuff. Both of these batteries right here, which you see right there, are different colored because they're on a different subgrid. We've got like a kind of functional example. So if you wanted to make a fan, you could use a rotor for that. That'd be kind of helpful. Or like an obstacle course, you can make it go a little bit faster. So that's pretty cool. And in fact, what we could do is if we go to our door one and we bump up that velocity, we'll see the maximum velocity is this. So it makes for a good obstacle course, but what if you wanted it to go a little bit faster? Well, that's where stacking rotors comes into play, and this is a stacked rotor. Now, the reason stacking rotors works is, well, I'll actually show you. It's a good example to show you. So let's go to our crazy rotors, is what I called them, and we'll give them 1 RPM, so 1 rotation per minute. No, not tilde RPMs, 1 RPM. Okay, so we'll see that this is actually rotating much faster than 1 rotation per minute. In fact, we can even count out how long it takes to do a quarter turn. Let's wait for it to go center and we'll count it out. Right now, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi. Okay, so it looks like it's actually taking maybe 20 seconds, unless I was counting fast, 20 seconds to go around in a full circle. Now, why is it like that if we're doing 1 rotation per minute? So the bottom one right here is doing 1 rotation per minute. This little subgrid is doing 1 rotation per minute, but on top of that, this one is doing 1 rotation per minute, and then this one's also doing 1 rotation per minute. So in total, we have 1, 2, 3 rotations per minute, which is 1 rotation every 20 seconds, which corresponds to what we counted as well. 5 seconds for a half, or for a quarter, gives 20 seconds for a full rotation. That's 3 rotations per minute. Now, by stacking rotors like this, you can actually make the rotor go much faster. So if we go to crazy rotors and bump that up to our max velocity, you'll see that it goes way faster than our other max velocity right there. In fact, it's 3 times as fast. It's pretty insane. Imagine trying to get through an obstacle like that. Now, you may run into problems later where the rotors are actually a bit wobbly. And we'll see. I don't think they're very wobbly here. But if you had, for instance, 10 stacked up, the rotors might be a bit wobbly, and that's where you would use that good old shear inertia tensor right there to make them more stable. Now, one final thing I'd like to mention with rotors before we stop the episode is that when dealing with subgrids, you can have a couple of problems every once in a while with something we like to call Clang. And that's essentially just where you make the subgrid blocks bleed into other blocks, and it starts causing a weird reaction in the game. Now, you might have heard of the term Clang before in Space Engineers. It's because Clang can be very destructive to your builds. If you make blocks get placed in a wrong way, such that they're like inside other blocks, or doing weird stuff in the game, sometimes the physics engine just wigs out. And we can actually see that probably if we bump up the torque, bump up the velocity a little bit, and then start messing with the rotor displacement. Let's see if we can get it to do anything crazy. Here, I'll bump up the rotor displacement, then I'll add some blocks on the bottom. How about that? Now, we'll see, in fact, it might actually work better if I start, yeah, there we go. If I start adding more rotors in really weird places, we'll start seeing, look, see that? It's starting to wig out a little bit. It's actually flipping out quite a bit, in fact. It's really not liking me placing these. So that's what I'm talking about when I say you want to try and avoid Clang as much as possible, because it can really mess with your builds a little bit. So imagine if this is something you spent like hours working on, and you were adding all this stuff right here. Look at that. Look at that. Oh, there it goes. It's kind of fun to mess with Clang, though, to be honest. It just, you know, it's just scary. And I figured I couldn't have an episode of talking about rotors without actually discussing Clang as well. That this could actually happen to your builds. So just be very careful when you're dealing with stuff that does weird stuff. Just be very careful not to make Clang happen. Otherwise, your entire build could go up in flames. And if you are doing something like this, make sure you have a backup as well. Oh my god, I love it. I just love it. All right, that's the end of our rotor episode. A bit more advanced than the last episode, but that's how I said we were going to do it. One basic, then one more advanced episode, then one basic, then one advanced. We're going to alternate like this because I think it's a good way to make sure that everyone kind of gets something from the series. But anyways, if you guys liked that episode, please hit the like button. Put your comments and your suggestions down below in the comments section below. And also, please tell me if I missed anything important related to rotors, because that should probably be addressed in the comments section below as well. And I'll see you guys in the next episode of Space Camp.